Each week we look at something in Baptist history, and last week we started the story of Fred Donaldson, you might recall, and we didn't leave it exactly here, but where it happened, an elderly missionary widow was in their home, and she planted the seed. She and her husband had served in China for years, and she planted the seed there in Pastor Donaldson's home. And he was, to back up, he was a pastor in Plainfield, Illinois. God had called him to preach. He had gotten his education, and he had been pastoring for about 8 years in Plainfield, Illinois. And they had this widow in their home, and she planted this seed that God, she felt was about to call someone to her former field in China, where she and her husband had served. And God used that to burden his heart, and within a week, God had called him to be that American pastor that would come to China. And as I told you last week, he stood before his people and told them that God was calling he and his wife to China. And in 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, without a single church supporting them, the Donaldsons boarded a ship in Vancouver on February 25th, 1933, and sailed to China. That would take them to Shanghai and then eventually to the city where they would serve Hangzhou. And it's said that amazingly, and this really is a miracle, within 6 months, Fred Donaldson was preached his first sermon in Chinese. Within a year, he was preaching normally in Chinese. And it was he could preach almost every week. And he began really working with and teaching the preacher boys that were already established there in that work. During his first term in China, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but Fred was used of God to establish 25 chapels in they would be almost like, for lack of a better term, in the surrounding villages around Hangzhou that were out of that church, in the Hangzhou Baptist Temple. And it's really a thrilling story. But what he did was, as he was there working, he felt that. Well, I'll just read you what he said. He said, he wrote, my biggest question after arriving in China was as to how best I could serve the Lord Jesus as a missionary there. I was 35 years of age and knew that learning a language would be very difficult. He said, missionary children are born and raised in China have an advantage over us adults who become missionaries. We can, by diligent study, learn the language and can talk and preach. But missionaries who have been raised in the land not only speak with the Chinese, but they can also think with the Chinese. He said, not having that advantage, I studied the question of how best I could invest my life. After seeing the fine young preachers and Bible women that connected with our work, how zealous they were for the Lord and for souls, and how able they were in reaching their own people with a little help from foreign friends, I decided this is the method that God had honored in our mission in the past, and it was his will for the future. He said, Dwight L. Moody used to say, it is better to put 10 men to work than to try to do the work of 10 men. And so in the city and the country churches around Hangzhou, I began to develop a special friendship with young men. And the idea being that he would witness to them and see them saved one-on-one, one by one, just a slow progression there as he saw them saved. And then that would allow then God to work on their hearts. And many of those young men then were called to preach. They had the facilities set up to teach them. They had a Bible college there. And this was the idea, was just to target the young men in their early 20s and get them saved, because God then could call them to preach. And that was very interesting how he did that. And as I said, within 2 years, he had 25 of those men preaching in churches in the villages around the Hangzhou. This produced great results, as I said, as these chapels were open. In 1937, however, war broke out, and this is the Chinese-Japanese, or the Sino-Japanese War, and the invading Japanese began to penetrate further and further inland. After 3 months, the missionaries were forced to flee Hangzhou. They traveled by night to a port where they took a steamer to Shanghai. After remaining in Shanghai for some time, actually the Lord burdened their hearts for the millions that were there, and that was a very great city, still a great city, and millions of people. And they conceived the idea of reaching the city. First, they would leave the war zone for furlough and return back as soon as possible so they could start serving the Lord in in Shanghai. So they left, went back to America for 8 years, for 8 months, in their first furlough. And then they returned to Shanghai in 1938 and then began that same idea of reaching young men and letting God work in their hearts and use them as pastoring churches. As I said, they started the church Shanghai Baptist Tabernacle, and that became the center of the spiritual activity. A Bible school was begun there in Shanghai. Dormitories were built, and Fred followed, as I said, that same plan of attack with the village chapels. And it's amazing how quickly he got things done. They were able to establish, using other men in the work, but to establish this Bible school and to build dormitories in that very next time on the field. Now, when war between America and Japan seemed inevitable, the Donaldsons sent their son Paul back to the States to finish high school and live there with his grandmother. And just a few months later, on December 7, 1941, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese had, at first, of course, the war had begun. America got into the war in 1941, but the world was kind of at war before that. And one of the worst places was the Japanese and their invasion of China previous to us getting in the war. We don't know much about that. We don't think much about that because it didn't involve us. But this was how shall I say, one of the most horrible aspects of World War II is what happened in China in that time. And so on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, Fred, Effie, and their 15-year-old daughter Lois found themselves standing in the cold all day long in a line that stretched for about 2 miles because they had to be registered as enemy status, and they were told they would be confined to their home by the Japanese. Some weeks later, they closed their home, and their home was closed, and they were reported to a prisoner of war camp. And they, along with about 1,100 others, would be placed in what was a bombed-out university, happened to be in Shanghai, and that would become their home. And that's where we're going to end the story today. We'll pick up that story.